I've had the opportunity to work with John for quite a few years, almost from the beginning, as I recall. John giving me a call, and how many have talked with John on the phone? A couple? Yeah? Yeah. The conversations are never short. In fact, when John calls, I make sure that I'm on a really long drive. It has to be at least an hour, or early in the morning when I don't have a lot of other stuff going on. So I've appreciated that about him, because what he wants to do is he wants to dig into the nuts and bolts of things and try to understand the background as much as possible so that he can apply the principles almost to the point of a fault, to be quite honest. He wants to understand every aspect of it, and his level of expectation associated with that is fairly high. So if you give him something to work with, he's going to expect it to come out fairly accurate in relationship to that. Now, in my case, I work with the University of Minnesota Extension in St. Louis County, and actually, in many cases, as I look around the room, folks that I have worked with over time, many of them have more on-the-ground experience than I do, but I will have to say, having my own operation, it has given me a lot of opportunity to experiment, try things, and also learn from you as farmers. Emma is my intern severance this year, and I always tell her very directly, you need to look, survey the situation when we go to a farm, and then try to learn one thing from that farm so that you can take that to someone else's farm, and even if this example isn't exactly the same, think about ways in which to implement it in different manners, but interpret what the results might be from that. And so from that standpoint, it really is what we all need to do as farmers. Coming here today is a really good example. As I look around, one thing that I saw immediately as an indicator of soil health, the castings on the ground. Even though we've driven in this area, we've walked in this area last year, the castings are very prevalent from the worms. You can tell that there's activity occurring in the soil. And so observing that, utilizing a shovel, we try to, as university folks, we try to boil it down to just simply saying, okay, what does this test say? This is what the results are. But in reality, you can utilize your senses of texture, feel, what it looks like, color, and the aspects of what other activities are going on in the area that will directly impact that. This morning, yesterday we were filming up in Williams, Minnesota for an upcoming virtual tour situation. And when we were there, the farmer asked us very directly, how is it working? I see that I'm growing covers. We're trying to work out a rotation. How is it working? And I said, well, have you dug a hole? You know? And it was kind of foreign to him. I said, well, what are your soil tests telling you? We need to utilize those tools, fairly inexpensive, especially soil tests. They're so cheap. I encourage people to utilize them at least once every other year, just as a way in which to gauge where you're going. The other thing about soil tests that I will tell you is that when you take a soil test, you can't count it as the only indicator. You have to look at the trends, because it depends on where you take the soil sample, what time of the year you take that soil sample, and understand that that stuff fluctuates throughout the year. So utilize it as a tool and look at it in in form of trends associated with what is going on. Then if you get a good handle on it, then perhaps some of these other biology tests, carbon dioxide burst tests, some of those begin to make a little bit more sense, but I still think that we don't have to get to that level of complexity to help you better understand what is going on in your fields. When I began to utilize cover crops, it was very, very simple. It was for my own purpose, meaning it was going to help me in feeding or extending my grazing season. So we chopped corn off or grazed corn off, and then we took winter rye and we seeded into that stubble. And in that particular case, the first example of what we did is we went ahead and grazed and moved the fence about every 3 days. And so we were getting that level of consumption and new ground, and it took time, but I seeded that with winter rye every time we moved to the next paddock. And what that did is it, first of all, helped me understand, if I wait until the end, the amount of impact of the overall plant production, the forage produced, was very, very substantial. Every single day at that time of the year makes a difference. So if you can get it in just a little bit earlier, it will help quite dramatically. The other thing that it did provide me is that the first year I used just winter rye. In years to follow, I utilized other species in conjunction with that, so including things like turnips and peas, tillage radishes. All of those things can help you in that understanding of capturing the nutrients that are in that soil, and or in essence providing fodder for the livestock if you have livestock. And if you're just recycling it back into the next crop, I think there's a tremendous amount of value in capturing that nutrient from an environmental standpoint. Finally, it also provided me the opportunity to stabilize that soil. And so with the use of that, it really has helped to minimize any erosion issues on our particular soil type. So with these things in mind, we began to explore other components of the uses of cover crops and no-till. And John talked briefly about the aspects of finding characteristics of trying it and having failures. One of the components that I really want to share with people is trying to help them to have success on that first try. So many folks that go into this have failures. That's to be expected. So we don't want you to do the whole farm, even a small portion of the farm, to attempt different approaches. 20 acres, 40 acres, depends on the operation that you're working with. Try a small amount and try the simple stuff. As I call it, pick the low-hanging fruit. And so with that in mind, it's really a good approach to doing that. Yesterday, as well with this producer, as we went around, he talked about how an area of his field got flooded in fall, and so much of his cover crop was below the ice as he was trying to graze that off in fall. And so he talked about having to drill holes in the ice to put the posts in the ground. How many have experienced that? Any of you? I know I have. Not that that is a bad thing, but he kind of, we asked him, well, were you frustrated with that? And he said, sure. But he said, we didn't lose any of that. Those all were nutrients that we recycled into the system and changed their form into an organic form that would continue to break down throughout the course of the year. I realize that many of you, nearly all of you, are crop producers, and so figuring out ways in which to integrate this is or can be a challenge in our shortened growing season. But I have heard the complaint my growing season is too short all over Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, and it seems like the folks that want to integrate covers and improve their soil health can do it if they have those desires. We have planes that sometimes can work. We have putting the seed on early, and then we have John, who will try just about any sort of crazy approach that we throw at him. And so with that in mind, I appreciate folks like John in regards to that. So a couple of things that I really think are important. I think it's important that you go out and really spend time in your fields, look at what you've got and where you want to go, create goals. Next is be creative about how you approach it. There was a conversation earlier about using small grains. They are really a component that can play an important part of that. And from what I have seen, there's an increase in demand for small grain over the last couple of years to the point of making small grains fairly profitable in some circumstances. You have to be creative about it, and I know that our systems aren't necessarily fully set up to handle oats or wheat, barley, but we created the system to support corn and soybeans, so integrating some small grains can be helpful. And the reason I say that is it gives you a little bit more season on both ends. And finally, I'd like to share a story from our own operation that I think it was learned from one of my dairy producers, experienced, I think is a better word than learned, because it was a learning process with the two of us together. And in his particular case, he was very cautious about using no-till. He is way up near Meadowlands, Minnesota, and as I said, a gentleman that was a dairy, and so therefore his background soil fertility was quite high. And why that is important is with soil fertilities quite high, he has the ability to, I would call it cheat sometimes. So if we tell him that the September 15th is the last date you should plant winter rye, he gets by with planting it on the 15th of October sometimes. I just shake my head, but it's reality, okay? I've told him numerous times not to do that. He does it, and routinely it has been successful. So that's something that I've learned from that. In addition to that, he's been utilizing a process of growing a mixture, including winter rye, clover, and oats in fall, planting that in the middle of to the end of August, grazing that oats off in fall, and then allowing that winter rye to come up in spring, and it gives him yet another forage crop from that same planting. Then after he gets done with that, whether he's harvested it as baleage or grazed it off, he then goes ahead and plants corn in that situation, and then utilizes that for forage. And then after that, he will once again do another crop of oats typically, and he does that to develop high quality feed, as the data from Wisconsin supports summer planting of oats late in the season after the summer solstice will give you high quality feed for feeding his dairy cattle. With all of those things in mind, a couple of components that we also think a lot about are the costs associated with cover crops. Yes, you can use cost share programs, but in his perspective, the aspects of dealing with that process can get cumbersome, and so he just wants to focus on his dairy. I appreciate that. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about what seed costs are, what to include in our mixtures, and some of those aspects, what those mixtures contain, and how can we benefit from the other things that we add into that mixture. With that in mind, it has really helped him become what I would consider one of the lower or lowest cost producers for milk in my region. And I feel as if it is an honor, as with some of you that I work with, an honor to have the opportunity to work with you and to learn from you. And so from my perspective today, I'm glad you're here. I hope that there's something that you leave today learning